Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, today we have one of our annual broadcasts. This one is going to be the 2019 Sights in the United States with the Kiss of Death. Now, to give you a little orientation on this, it's, believe it or not, one of the more popular of these annual podcast topics that we do. And here's why. This topic is on places that you really should think twice before you go to. But I also need to say something, and I'll repeat this. If you really are trying to find a place that has a low cost, or you get a discount on a type of practice, these are locations that you really should look for because they're not doing that well, and typically the sellers are motivated. Bad news is these are not good locations when it comes to doing startups. So, welcome to this 2019 Kiss of Death. Let me go ahead and jump right into sharing my screen.
And as you get started, Scott, we really ought to say that you always make somebody mad every year.
Oh, God. Okay, let me just stop the share for a second. Guys, this makes so many people angry when I talk about it because some broker is going to say, wait a second, you're trying to make it seem like I'm not in a good place or this practice I'm representing isn't going to sell. Well, look, doctor, just to remind you, most of the time our viewers and listeners on this podcast are people who are buyers. They're not the sellers.
Right.
So I'm sorry we may have a little bit of a disagreement. My job is to give the people who are viewing this an idea of places that are going to show promise. And that's what this whole thing is about. And this is the one on cautionary tales. Now, before I get too further along, next week we're doing the Places with Promise podcast. And we're going to talk about, and I believe I'm going to go up to 20, of locations throughout the United States that are showing a pretty good possibility with the particular emphasis on a startup, not just a purchase. But if you can find a practice for purchase in this area, so much the better. So I hope everybody understands that I'm really kind of on your side and I'm trying to help. That's the purpose of this. So let me go to my PowerPoint presentation on this topic. I know that these are such beautiful graphics that everybody's just amazed. And yes, I do have maps. Unfortunately, this may go just a little long. Don't be mad because I've got a lot of stuff to share. So now, do you remember back Lost in Space, the old show? There was a robot who'd run around, danger, Will Robinson, danger, and it was supposed to be this big warning every time you do the same thing. Well, I just want to say danger because there are some sites within almost every state that you really ought to know. This is going to be tough. Now, let me explain why it is that what it takes to join this particular august group. In almost every case, a location that has the kiss of death is losing population. Now, that doesn't mean that the whole state is, as a group, losing population, but it means that certain parts are losing, and often it's the demographic population that you want to keep that tends to leave. So to give you a quick example, California as a state is growing. However, the parts that you want and the kind of people moving in are not necessarily the people you want. It means that within California, you have to be careful. Now, why a place is losing its population is one of the more important things to think about. The reason that the place might be losing is not going to be the same in every case, and I'll explain as I go through these. There is typically, with a place that has a kiss of death, it's got a higher than average risk. I want to let you know, if you are not risk averse, sometimes you can make a lot of money when there's a place that other people are scared to go. So I'm not trying to say don't take risk, but they're also going to generally be higher risks because of the costs and the regulations for setting up a practice of any type are going to be riskier. Now, some people are going to say, oh, you'd always worked with dentists. Look, I'm going to tell you this is true for veterinarians, for physicians, for optometrists, for all of them. These are the states that everybody's going to have a risk in. Also, you probably know that I have a lot of friends who are brokers and professionals and demographers who are in my posse, my peeps. And we talk about places all the time that are not doing well or places that are. And these often are the ones that come up where people will say, man, this place sucks hose water. It is in the potty and it's already starting to swirl counterclockwise, if you know what I mean. So let's kind of go on. I want you to understand a couple of things, though. And I always have to bring this up because people forget. Just because it's a kiss of death site doesn't mean you can't succeed. Just because you have a practice in a kiss of death site doesn't mean you can't sell. But it definitely means doing startups, that's going to be a tough sell. That's that third point. So ultimately, if you want a good deal, a place that might have potential, the places with the kiss of death are often locations that you ought to consider. Just because you're saying it's on the list, it doesn't mean you're doomed. Okay, I just want to mention that. Or if you're in the middle of a purchase, it doesn't mean you're in trouble. But it does mean especially that if you find a practice, you really have to get a practice site viability report. You got to know the risks of that particular part of the marketplace. That's why we're bringing it up, okay? So please, we don't have anything against you. All right, maybe something. No, I'm sorry. Here we go. We're going to talk about, and take these, they're basically 10. The first one we're going to talk about is in Ohio. There are two separate locations that are on the kiss of death. They have lost close to 50% over 20 years of their population. It was much bigger, and now it's gone much lower. And what's even worse is the amount of money that they're making is so much less than it was before. Ironically, places on the kiss of death site often have the better reimbursement rates because they can't find enough providers in the area, and they got to bribe them to do it. So two of the locations that we're talking about in Ohio are kind of centered around Youngstown, where Warren, Sharon, and Youngstown are. Sharon, by the way, is not in Ohio. I'll show you on the map in just a second, but it's right within that cluster of cities. The other one, which is really tough, is the area between Cincinnati and Dayton, Ohio. Now, Columbus, Ohio is not on this list, and that's because it continues to grow and do well. But these particular metropolitan areas are doing badly. So let me explain. This is Cincinnati and Dayton. And as you can tell, there is a lot of infrastructure between the towns. Middletown is right in the middle, and Hamilton is close by. These are locations that are having a problem. All of them are, and for the same reasons. It's the counties themselves are kind of averse to allowing new growth. Now, whenever a community has the idea that we're just not going to take some of those scummy people and allow them to come, you know you're going to have problems. The other problem is when there's a large number of stressed businesses and residents, what's happening is the government has decided, hey, you know who needs to pick up the bill for those poor people? You. And what they're doing is they're raising taxes. So these are some of the higher placed taxes that you're going to find in the United States. Now, I'm going to tell you, these are not the highest on the list of places that have danger, but it represents a kind of closing in on itself that I'm saying, guys, I really want you to be careful. Muncie, by the way, as you can see up in the upper left, also is having a problem too, and much for the same reason. It's more of an attitude that exists among the government types who are in the taxable bodies that are not really allowing new growth, and I have a problem with that. Now, someone is going to say, wait a second, I was just in Cincinnati. It looks fantastic. Yes, I know there are places within each of these communities that look good. I'm going by the regional challenge. So trust me, as we look at data, these are places that are distressed. Now, here's the other place that I first started off with, which is kind of Youngstown and Warren. Again, they've lost a lot of their population. As you'll notice, Sharon is right above Youngstown and off to the east, suffering in a similar way. It's as though the state of Ohio just doesn't want growth. So they've made it hard for large employers to step in, and I got a problem with that. Now, let's go on to the next area so we don't lose our time. This is Scranton, Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre, and Pittsburgh. Now, these are not all right together either. They're regional problems that are going on with Pennsylvania overall. So just to show you on the map, That's the Scranton and Wilkes-Barre. Let me explain something to you that happened in Pennsylvania and is true of the region. And I'm not going to pick on the people in these two communities because actually I think they're reasonably well governed. The county administration and the city administrations are doing a pretty reasonable job. The problem here is the federal government decided to wage war on coal. Coal has long been a major employer, and it really is the reason for these places being where they are. So when we talk about the Rust Belt, people seem to forget that the thing that made the rust was steel. And the steel and iron was able to be mined and processed here because of coal. It wasn't very far to carry the fuel. Well, as coal and coke became more difficult to, keep as total green technologies, the area suffered. Now, originally, people were saying, oh, this is a Democrat stronghold. Well, I want to just tell you the honest goodness truth. Donald Trump took Pennsylvania, and everybody was surprised. What? This was supposed to be a Democrat stronghold. Well, Hillary Clinton kind of ignored Pennsylvania as some other states that are in the Rust Belt. And what he did is kind of came in and said, no, we need to put more money into clean coal and to be able to sustain the employment base here. And people have. Now, it is, frankly, a very large union location. And whenever you find unions, if you happen to be in a unionized industry, it's great because it just means that everything's going well for you. The bad news is, if you're not in one of those industries that is unionized, it can make small business and professional practices have a much harder time. Now, I want you to know that the places that I'm mentioning, and here's Pittsburgh, in Pennsylvania, I personally believe they have a much brighter future than perhaps what the numbers have reflected in the last 2 or 3 years. But what we need to be able to do is to loosen up, on particularly the county level, to allow more practices to come in and to hire people at a lower wage. When the wages are artificially inflated, it puts you right in the middle of the kiss of death locations. Now, you probably all know this, that when a doctor is hiring staff, sometimes they'll try to find people they don't have to pay a ton of money to. They'll do that by finding a bright, young, moderately well-educated person that they can train. But as the minimum wage increases have gone up so much, it made it so that that model is much more difficult. So I'm saying that's a problem. Now, this is the first time that I've put in such a large region. But I'm seeing something here, and this is upstate New York, not New York City, and not even the extreme eastern side of the state. It's going to be western New York right up to Albany. Now, let me kind of explain what I'm seeing here. Buffalo is right next to Canada, and that's one of the major places to go. Rochester and Syracuse are very different economies, but each one of them has had the industries that they're in regulated almost out of existence. Now, look, I am one of the first to say that I love the Finger Lakes region. I mean, it is a great place for outdoor entertainment. It's just gorgeous. And the people, by the way, are fantastic. But what's happened within this region is the cost of housing has become very expensive, which means there's a lot of older people over 50 who are in this area, and they're just lovely people. But the younger people can't afford, young families, to move into these areas. And they haven't done anything for the jobs in order to make this so that it is a reasonable place to find work. Now, as you can tell, Albany's right there at the end. And the bottom line is this. Syracuse and Utica are lovely college towns, but once people graduate, they leave. To a degree, this is also true of Buffalo and Rochester. The problem is hanging on to those young families. Once they form their families and graduate from school, they leave because they can't afford to stay. You don't blame them, but it's just a reality. And until such time as major employers are welcomed into this area and are not just necessarily given incentives, but rather that the state and the counties get off their back, it is not going to change. And so when I talk about being kind of in a poor place with a kiss of death, that's really what has caused it here. Now you'll notice that's not the same thing that was going on in Ohio and, well, in fact, in any of these other locations. This is a little bit unique to upstate New York. Now, New York is unfortunately ruled by New York City. The voters elect all the people in the state capital of Albany, and they kind of tell them what to do. And these other cities in upstate New York are sort of dragged along, kicking and screaming, and they're not given much of an opportunity to change things. This is also a problem in other states, especially in the West Coast. Now, let's talk about Detroit, Michigan. Definitely on the kiss of death. Now, here's the thing you have to understand. Detroit, when it was considered a region, was dying. It was having a terrible time in the 90s and into the early teens of this century. But what's happened is Detroit itself is no longer the region that was having problems. It's more of the local area. Detroit itself, however, still smacks of the kiss of death. On the other hand, if you look at Royal Oak and Ann Arbor and Troy, those are communities that are on the outlying sites that actually are doing better. I was surprised to look at the data on Flint, Michigan, and realize it isn't just an old Rust Belt auto town. Flint has got a research component to it, and it's doing reasonably well. So what's happened is that area right around inner Detroit is still suffering terribly, and because of the city and the county management, it doesn't look like that's going to change. So what they have done is, rather than say we need to increase the attractiveness of our area, they're trying to penalize employers, thinking somehow if we just raise taxes on the wealthy, well, then everything will be fixed. And it isn't. So that's why doctors, when I mentioned Michigan as being a problem for doctors, it's not every part of it you can't have a practice. It's that you as a taxpayer have got a target on your back. And that is making things a little scary. So moving on, this is one of the golden oldies of the kiss of death. Chicago, Illinois. Now, what's hard to put in words is just how many people have moved out of Chicagoland. It used to be a net target for employment that started in the 1950s and 60s, went into the 70s, but then as the 80s came along and the 90s, and then it's just gotten worse and worse. Look, there has always been corruption. It's always been a machine city. And therefore, there is a large population that is just happy as punch not to let the area change. But the problem is there are alternatives now that there weren't before. Now, keep in mind, a lot of people moved to Chicago from the South. Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, they moved up here. And now those people have kind of begun to say, you know, it really is friggin' cold here. It's freezing. I don't want to be here anymore. And it's super expensive. And even people who make a lot of money are kind of reevaluating, why am I the one who's trying to support all the school districts here? Why are we allowing crime? And there, by the way, in Chicago is a lot of crime. Now, ironically, the American Dental Association, the American Medical Association, there are several of them based in Chicago. And they've always kind of been the friendly place to bring people for conventions. But the convention business in Chicago is beginning to suffer as well. Not as many people are saying, gee, a convention in January, well, maybe that's not where I want to be. And so people are beginning to think, why am I doing things the same old way I've done? So they're challenging the assumptions. The two statistics were U-Haul and Ryder trucks that really woke me up to this. The cost of getting a rental van so that you can move out of the town is so much higher than what it is to bring a truck into this town. That's where the data that demographers are using. Now, right at the bottom of this area, you see East Chicago and Gary, Indiana. Gary was always a joke. People going, oh, Gary, that's terrible, you know. But northern Indiana has all of a sudden kind of woken up. And it's now an alternative so that reasonably you can live in one and work in the other and do really well with that trade imbalance on taxes. But the property values have become such that having a nice place in the Chicagoland area is much more difficult than it's been before. Plus, there's a serious conflict with the people down in Springfield, Illinois, where the state capital is. They are not happy with what's going on in Chicago, and we may yet see that tension boil over. I think it's going to be interesting to see. So let's talk about another multiple state location that's having the kiss of death. Connecticut and Rhode Island. Now, here's something ironic about it, and a lot of people don't seem to recall this, but Connecticut has one of the highest median household incomes in the United States. So does Rhode Island. And yet, people are leaving Connecticut and they're leaving Rhode Island, and they don't have the people to spare, and they're leaving. Why? Because the property and the cost of living costs are so high, they're forcing people out. And the truth is, it used to be, there was a time in which you could take a train from Connecticut down into Manhattan, and you could live in this nice suburban area. I don't know if you remember the Dick Van Dyke Show. They used to live in Connecticut, in New Rochelle. Well, that train ride has become so much longer, more expensive, and really a pain in the neck that people can't easily commute like they used to. You know, they're not hooked up to that major metropolitan area. So what's happened is the practices have had to rethink where they are. They have to set up in Connecticut and in Rhode Island to serve the population that's there all throughout the day. Now, as we look at the actual towns, Hartford has always been the big insurance center. New Haven and Bridgeport have always had a nice, middle-class, white-collar population. Providence had something similar. However, because of the financial stresses of the states and counties, they've so raised their taxes that Connecticut's one of the highest tax states in the Union, and Rhode Island is right there with them. We used to have the joke about Taxachusetts. See what I did there? That's Massachusetts with, I don't know if you realize the humor that goes in this podcast, but that's all right. Anyway, the point is, it's made these places much more difficult. So rather than stay here, a lot of people have decided to move north into New Hampshire and into even Massachusetts. It's less expensive to do that, and there's every infrastructure benefit that there ever was. I think, if anything, Rhode Island and Connecticut are slowly putting themselves out of business. Now, the practices that are here are generally, worth something, you can certainly tell, and it's not that everybody here is poor. The problem is growth. The growth is gone, and the growth isn't likely to come back anytime soon, and that's what worries me about this region. All right, now this may get me some hate mail. It may even get me a couple of death threats, but one of those places that has the kiss of death is New Jersey. All of New Jersey? No, not all of New Jersey, but New Jersey is stressing itself to death, and it's showing very little, if any, benefit in social discipline or in financial discipline. Now, Hudson County, which is just across the river from Manhattan, is one of the only places in the state that's doing reasonably well. If you go south toward Philadelphia, and you look out at Long Branch and Asbury Park, which is on the shore. By the way, as you probably know, New Jersey doesn't have a coast. It has a shore. And remember the gambling whole thing that went in there and Trump lost his shirt? Look, it's a serious problem. And that's because people that used to enjoy the Jersey Shore or that consider the more rural, suburban nature of New Jersey are realizing as soon as they step into New Jersey, they're being taxed. In fact, if they say you're leaving with any money in your pocket, you either haven't visited our casinos or paid your taxes. Now, there are exceptions, like I've said. New Jersey has a few places. But this is, again, one of those places that if you're thinking, I'd like to go there, you better get a practice site viability report. Trenton used to be a middle-class place. Well, it is no longer. I love Philly, but remember, Philadelphia is actually across the river in Pennsylvania. And while it may come back, there's not a lot of reason for New Jersey to invest in Greater Philly on the Jersey side. So, yes, the land is there. Atlantic City is still there, but it doesn't have the panache nor the benefit to keep people coming. So, you're looking for a place in New Jersey that can be found? I'm just saying, boy, so much of the state is in the kiss of death. That's one reason why so many people are leaving New Jersey. Now, let's talk about something else that may get me in trouble, and that is coastal California. I used to name the cities. I'm not doing that so much anymore because people were saying, yeah, but what about X, Y, and Z? Now, let's just talk real briefly about the state of California. Obviously, there are two parts primarily that have the greatest population density, and that's going to be the San Francisco Bay Area and Southern California. The problem that we're seeing in two of the counties in Northern California is San Francisco and San Mateo County. Now, obviously, Santa Clara County, where San Jose is crazy expensive. Median house value is $1.2 million. $1.2 million. And don't even begin to think about owning property within San Francisco. So obviously we know that the prices are going up, but what's also going down is the quality of life. Literally, you cannot walk from one side of the street to the other without stepping in human poop or making sure that there's not a needle sticking out of it. I mean, the quality of life in the urban areas is getting bad. Now, in Los Angeles, we're seeing the same thing. In the urban parts of Los Angeles, the quality of life is going down. But in both areas, that's not really why they're on the kiss of death list. It's because of the cost of practicing here has gone up dramatically. With a very high starting minimum wage of $15 an hour, just remember that's the starting wage. So if you have someone who is earning $13 an hour, and that was not a bad wage just a year or two ago, and they were your staff person, now the minimum is going to be $17 to $20 an hour, because they're not going to go back to the minimum wage where you just hire anybody. The kid that sweeps the floor gets that. So it's making all of the wages go up dramatically. Now that's having the effect of making it more difficult for practices, but it also is making it more difficult for any business to come here because the cost of doing business, the cost per employee, is crazy high. If you look at Los Angeles County, growth is almost stagnant. And that is amazing because when I grew up in Los Angeles County, it was a big place to go. Places like Orange County were also considered the alternative to Los Angeles. But there are a few facts are now playing in. There is a movement in California to stop urban sprawl, meaning they don't want to build houses. This is true in Southern California, and it's becoming a big problem, especially in places where the demand is high, like in Riverside County and northern San Diego County. They just don't let them build. And they've added things like solar panels to every new house that raises the price of the house by $10,000 to $20,000 on top of everything else that's gone up. Therefore, it's a recipe for disaster. And one little thing I'll tell you, you also know that the new governor, Gavin Newsom, has promised basically Medicare, Medicaid for all. I mean, this idea, everybody gets insurance, everybody gets benefits, including dental benefits. When that happens, everybody, the state is going bankrupt. Trust me. Now, I think the Central Valley is the exception, but the problem is they've gone through so many problems because of water, and the state has built no dams since the water has come back. They're still going to go to the farmers and take that water from them. That's a scary thing. So just saying, we're looking at problems. Couple of other places before we wrap up. Seattle. Now, I want to make sure that there's a distinction between Kings County, which is the county that Seattle is in, and Greater Seattle and Urban Seattle. Now, Greater Seattle is actually a very large area that is built around the Sound and goes into Eastgate and Hazelwood and the high-tech areas up there where there's manufacturing. But it also goes down to Tacoma. Guys, I think that greater Seattle, the outlying communities, still have serious hope. I think they're desirable places to live, and the employment is certainly favorable. So that's good. The cost of housing has become a very big problem. The other thing is getting around in Seattle is becoming burdensome. So people from outside the area are having a very hard time trying to get in. Now, that is why Seattle, I'm talking about the city itself, not the whole region, is on the kiss of death. So therefore, is there potential there, I suppose? But just make sure you know that neighborhood you're in is viable. The last one is Hawaii. Hey, who doesn't love to go to Hawaii? Nobody. Who can afford to make a living in Hawaii? Nobody. It is one of those places that is so expensive in which to live. Now, remember, there used to be a time in which if you just chose the right island, like Oahu, you could make a living there. And there's always nice little islands like Maui that you could vacation. And the island of Hawaii was one of those places that you just had everything you wanted. The problem is, it used to be that Asia was supporting Hawaii. A lot of Asians moved here, bought land, developed it. The problem is right now, Asia's not doing well. And therefore, Hawaii has fallen on hard times, or should have. Therefore, it's more expensive, more difficult to set up a practice and maintain it. And of course, one of the little cultural things is they hate you. I mean, they hate anybody who's not Hawaiian. They call you a haole, which, if you really look it up, is not a compliment, okay? I just want to say. So, next week we're going to do the Places with Promise. Don't miss that episode, because we're going to tell you where to go that has a reasonable place to start up. Mike, I'm sorry, I've gone way long.
Yeah. That's okay. That's okay. I think we'll end it right there. We'll just tell people, of course, we still have the student report offer out there if you want to get information on that, because I know a lot of the people that are watching this are going to be students that are trying to plan out their next 5 or 10 years. Go to dentalpracticeinsiders.com/student and get more information there, requests for that report. It's really popular, especially this time of year with students. And Scott is the head guy to go to for that kind of information.
Indeed. And by the way, next week won't be so depressing. So I'm really sorry. It's kind of like, yeah, I'm sorry your grandma's sick and has a bad fever. So sorry. So all right, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. Mike, thanks for sitting by and making sure I didn't offend too many people.
Oh, yeah.
Really appreciate your help. All right, everybody. Thanks so much. And tell your friends and neighbors to come visit us at drdemographics.com.